Hi everyone, I'm Emma.
I'm Jack.
Welcome to our channel. I had a strange experience yesterday. I was standing at a train station, and the train was supposed to arrive in about 8 minutes. Normally, 8 minutes isn't a long time at all. If someone tells you that you have 8 minutes to finish something, you probably think, that's not enough time. But when you're standing on a platform waiting for a train, 8 minutes can suddenly feel surprisingly long.
That's true. Waiting changes the way we experience time. 8 minutes when you're busy can disappear without you noticing, but 8 minutes when you're staring at an empty railway track can feel like much more than 8 minutes. You start checking the time, and somehow only 2 minutes have passed. Then you check again, and another minute has disappeared. It makes you wonder whether time actually moves differently when we're waiting.
I had my phone with me, so I could have easily distracted myself. I could have watched a video, answered messages, read something, or checked social media. But for some reason, I decided not to. I just stood there and watched the platform. There were people everywhere. Some were talking, some were looking at their phones, one person was reading a newspaper, and another person kept looking down the track every few seconds.
And you probably started noticing things you normally wouldn't notice.
I did. That's actually what made the whole experience interesting. I started paying attention to the people around me because I wasn't filling the time with my phone. I noticed that everyone had a completely different way of waiting. One man was walking back and forth near the platform sign. A woman kept checking the electronic board. A student was sitting on the floor with a backpack beside him. An older couple were having a quiet conversation as if they weren't in a hurry at all.
That's fascinating because waiting reveals a lot about people. When people are busy, they're focused on whatever they're doing. But when they have to wait, you can sometimes see their habits more clearly. Some people become restless. Some become absorbed in their phones. Some start conversations with strangers. Some simply stand there and look around.
And I realized that I usually belong to the phone group. Whenever I have 30 seconds with nothing to do, I automatically reach for my phone, waiting for coffee. Phone, waiting for an elevator. Phone, sitting in a restaurant before someone arrives. Phone, waiting for a website to load. Phone, I don't even make a conscious decision anymore.
I do the same thing. It's almost become a reflex. The moment there's an empty space in time, the phone appears in our hands. What's interesting is that we don't necessarily have anything important to check. Sometimes we unlock the phone, look at the screen, scroll for a few seconds, and then realize there's nothing new.
I've done that many times. And then, 5 minutes later, I do it again.
Which suggests that we're not always checking because there's something new. Sometimes we're checking because we're uncomfortable with the feeling of waiting.
That's a much more interesting explanation. We aren't necessarily looking for information. We're looking for something to do.
Right? The phone gives us an immediate activity. It removes that empty feeling.
And maybe that's why waiting has become harder. We have so many ways to avoid it now.
I was thinking about that recently. Imagine someone waiting for a bus 30 years ago. They might have read a newspaper, talked to someone, looked at the street, or simply stood there. They had fewer options for distraction. Today, if a bus is 3 minutes late, many people immediately start checking an app, then messages, then social media, then the news, and before they know it, the bus arrives.
So they technically waited, but they didn't really experience the waiting.
Exactly, they filled it.
And maybe filling every empty moment has changed our relationship with time.
I think it has. We're surrounded by things that respond instantly. You tap a screen and something happens. You send a message and it arrives almost immediately. You search for information and get an answer. You order food and can watch the delivery driver move toward your house. You buy something online and can track the package from the warehouse to your front door.
Which means that waiting has become more visible. In the past, you might simply know that your food would arrive when it arrived. Now you can see that the driver is 3 minutes away, then 2 minutes away, then somehow remains 2 minutes away for 5 minutes.
That's one of the funniest things about delivery tracking. You start watching the little map as if you're participating in the delivery.
And you become emotionally involved in the driver's location.
You see the little icon stop moving and immediately think, what's happening?
Maybe the driver is just parking.
Of course, but when you're hungry and waiting, 5 minutes can feel very different.
That brings us to something important. Waiting isn't only about time. It's also about what we're waiting for.
Absolutely. If you're waiting for something you really want, the wait feels longer. If you're waiting for something unpleasant, it can feel even longer. And if you're waiting for something you're excited about, sometimes the anticipation becomes part of the experience.
Like waiting for a holiday.
Exactly. Waiting for a trip can actually be enjoyable. You book the hotel, look at photographs, plan where you're going to eat, check the weather, and imagine yourself there. The waiting period becomes part of the trip.
But waiting for the result of a job interview is completely different.
Very different. You can't really enjoy that kind of waiting because you don't know what the result will be. You're not simply waiting for an event. You're waiting for information that could change your plans.
And that's where uncertainty becomes important.
Yes, I think uncertainty is one of the biggest reasons waiting feels difficult. If I tell you, I'll call you at 7, and it's 6:30, you're not really worried. You know what is going to happen. But if I say, I'll call you sometime tonight, suddenly every few minutes feels uncertain.
You don't know whether you should start doing something else.
Exactly. You don't know whether the next 5 minutes are free or whether you need to stay available.
That's something I notice with appointments too. If someone says they'll arrive at 3, I can organize my afternoon around that. But if they say they'll arrive between 3 and 5, the entire 2-hour period feels occupied.
That's a really good example. The waiting time may be longer, but the bigger problem is that you can't use the time properly.
You're physically free, but mentally unavailable.
Yes, that's exactly what it feels like.
And I think that's why waiting for another person can sometimes be more frustrating than waiting for a machine. A machine doesn't care if you're annoyed. But when you're waiting for someone, there's a social relationship involved.
Right, if a train is late, you may be frustrated, but you don't think the train is deliberately disrespecting you.
Unless you're having a really bad day.
Fair enough.
But if a friend says they'll meet you at 7 and arrives at 7:30 without saying anything, the 30 minutes can feel personal.
Because now you're not only waiting, you're interpreting their behavior.
You start wondering whether they forgot, whether something happened, whether they don't respect your time, whether they're still coming, whether you should call them.
And suddenly, 30 minutes contains a whole story.
That's why communication matters so much when people are waiting for each other. A simple message saying, "I'm running 20 minutes late," can completely change the experience.
Yes, the actual waiting time hasn't changed. You're still waiting 20 minutes, but now you understand what's happening.
And you can make a decision.
Exactly. You can get a coffee, sit somewhere, read, or continue working. You have information, so you have some control.
Which makes me wonder whether people dislike waiting itself or dislike feeling powerless.
I suspect it's often the second one. If you have some control, waiting becomes easier.
Let's say you're waiting at an airport. You know the flight is delayed by an hour, but the airport has restaurants, shops, comfortable seats, charging stations, and information screens. You can decide what to do with the hour.
Exactly. Compare that with being stuck in traffic without knowing whether you'll be moving again in 5 minutes or an hour. That kind of waiting feels much worse because you can't really do anything.
And you don't know how long it will last.
That's the worst combination. No control and no clear ending.
Maybe that's why people become so frustrated in traffic jams.
Definitely. You're sitting in a car, you're not moving, and you can see other cars in front of you and behind you. You know you're losing time, but you don't know how much time.
And then you start calculating.
Everyone calculates. If I had left 10 minutes earlier, if I had taken another road, maybe that lane is moving faster.
And then you watch another lane move slightly faster and immediately regret your decision.
That's one of the cruelest parts of traffic.
You switch lanes, and 5 minutes later your old lane starts moving.
Then you start thinking you made the worst possible choice.
Even though there was no way you could have known.
That's another interesting part of waiting. We often judge our decisions using information we only received later.
Yes, at the moment you chose the lane, you didn't know what would happen.
But after seeing the other lane move, you feel as if you should have known.
Waiting gives us too much time to replay decisions.
And that's true far beyond traffic.
You mean things like waiting for an email?
Exactly. Imagine you're waiting for an important email. You sent your application 3 days ago. Nothing has happened. You start thinking about the application again. You remember one sentence you wrote. You wonder whether you should have written something differently. You reread the email you sent. You start imagining what the other person might be thinking.
And none of that changes the result.
No, but your brain doesn't like uncertainty, so it tries to solve the problem by thinking about it repeatedly.
That's probably why waiting can be mentally exhausting, even when you're physically doing nothing.
Yes, you can spend an entire afternoon doing almost nothing physically and still feel tired, because your mind has been constantly checking, predicting, and imagining.
That's such a strange thing about waiting. From the outside, someone might say, "You didn't do anything today."
But inside your head, you may have been working all day.
And sometimes that mental work is completely useless.
That's the frustrating part.
Maybe we need to learn how to wait without constantly trying to predict the outcome.
That's easier said than done,
Of course.
especially when the outcome matters.
Let's take a job interview. You prepare for the interview, you attend it, you answer the questions, and then it's over. Suddenly there's nothing else you can do. The decision is in someone else's hands.
That's a perfect example of forced waiting.
You can tell yourself to relax, but then your brain starts reviewing the conversation.
Why did I say that?
Did that answer sound confident?
Maybe they didn't like my answer.
They smiled when I said that. Was that a good sign?
You can analyze a 2-minute conversation for 3 days.
And somehow, every tiny detail becomes evidence.
Even the way they said goodbye.
They said, "We'll be in touch." Does that mean anything?
Usually it means they'll be in touch.
But when you're waiting, ordinary language suddenly becomes mysterious.
That's because you want certainty from information that isn't designed to provide certainty.
And that's a useful lesson about communication. Sometimes we hear exactly what was said, but we also hear what we hope it means.
Yes, waiting creates space for interpretation.
And that can be dangerous in relationships too.
Definitely. Imagine you send a message to someone and they don't reply for several hours. You may know perfectly well that there are hundreds of possible reasons. They could be working, driving, sleeping, talking to someone, dealing with a problem, or simply away from their phone.
But if you care about the message, your brain may choose one explanation.
And usually the explanation that creates the most emotional reaction.
That's interesting. We don't always choose the most likely explanation. We choose the explanation that feels most important.
Exactly. Waiting magnifies small details.
A short reply can feel significant. A delayed reply can feel significant. A period at the end of a sentence can suddenly feel significant.
And then someone sends a completely normal message the next morning, and you realize you spent the entire evening inventing a story.
Which is why waiting for communication can be harder than waiting for a physical thing.
Because a physical thing has a location. A person has thoughts, feelings, priorities in their own life.
You can't see what's happening on the other side.
Right, and the less information you have, the more your imagination fills the gap.
That makes me think about childhood. When I was younger, if a friend didn't call, there wasn't necessarily a way to know what they were doing. You just had to wait.
Yes, and perhaps people were more accustomed to that kind of uncertainty.
Maybe. Although I remember waiting by the phone for someone to call.
That must have felt incredibly slow.
It did. You couldn't send another message saying, "Are you going to call?" You just waited.
Technology has removed some forms of waiting and created others.
That's an important point.
We don't wait for letters as often, but we wait for replies to instant messages. We don't wait to develop photographs, but we wait for people to respond to our posts. We don't wait for information to arrive in the newspaper, but we wait for websites to load or apps to refresh.
So maybe technology doesn't eliminate waiting. It changes the type of waiting we experience.
Exactly.
And sometimes It makes the waiting more psychologically intense because we know the information could arrive at any moment.
That's true. If you send a letter, you don't expect an answer in the next 30 seconds. But if you send a message, you know the person could reply immediately.
So the possibility of immediate response changes our expectations.
Yes, and expectations are a huge part of patience.
If something takes longer than we expected, it feels slow even if the actual amount of time is reasonable.
Exactly. 10 minutes can feel short if you expected 15. 10 minutes can feel terrible if you expected 2.
So our experience of waiting depends partly on the difference between expected time and actual time.
Yes, and that explains why restaurants sometimes make customers more frustrated simply by not giving them any information. If you sit for 20 minutes without knowing what's happening, you start imagining that something is wrong. But if someone says, "Your food will take another 20 minutes because the kitchen is very busy," you may accept it.
Because you've been given a new expectation.
Right.
And maybe that's why estimated arrival times are so powerful. Even if they're not perfectly accurate, they give our minds something to hold on to.
Exactly. People often prefer an imperfect estimate to no information at all.
Even if the estimate changes later.
Yes, at least you have a framework.
That makes me think about customer service. Sometimes people become angry because they've been told to wait, but nobody explains why.
Yes, please hold, is one of the least satisfying sentences in the English language.
Especially when you're listening to the same music for 15 minutes.
And then someone answers and says, "Can you hold for another moment?"
That's when patience becomes a serious personal challenge.
But again, the problem isn't only the waiting, it's the lack of control.
You can't see what's happening,
You don't know whether anyone is working on your problem.
and you can't decide whether to continue waiting or hang up.
Exactly. You're trapped between two choices and both feel bad.
This makes me wonder whether patience is actually a skill that can be developed.
I think it can, but I don't think patience means enjoying waiting. It means being able to tolerate uncertainty without letting it control your behavior.
That's a much better definition.
You can be impatient internally, but still behave patiently.
So patience doesn't mean you never feel frustrated.
No, you can think, "This is taking forever," while still speaking politely to the person helping you.
That's important.
Because emotions aren't always under our control, but our response can be.
And perhaps that's where maturity comes into the picture.
Maybe, when you're younger, you may expect the world to respond to you quickly. As you get older, you learn that many things simply take time.
Learning a language,
Building a career,
making close friendships,
recovering from mistakes,
learning to understand yourself.
all of those things involve waiting.
And none of them can be rushed very easily.
You can work hard, but you can't completely control the timing.
That's difficult because modern life often teaches us that everything can be optimized.
Yes, we have productivity systems, scheduling apps, faster computers, faster transportation, faster communication. We start believing that if we organize everything correctly, we should be able to eliminate delays.
But life doesn't work like a machine.
Exactly, people get tired. Weather changes, trains break down, children get sick, meetings run late, someone needs more time to think. Plans change.
And no productivity system can completely remove uncertainty.
Right, that's why learning to wait may actually be becoming more important, not less important.
That's an interesting contradiction. The faster our technology becomes, the more valuable patience may become.
I think so.
Because speed is useful, but not everything should be fast.
Exactly. A fast answer isn't always a good answer.
A fast decision isn't always a wise decision.
A fast conversation isn't always a meaningful conversation.
And fast learning isn't always deep learning.
That's especially true with language. You can memorize 100 words in a day, but that doesn't mean you'll naturally use them in conversation.
You need time for the words to become familiar.
You need to hear them in different situations. You need to make mistakes. You need to forget them and encounter them again.
And eventually, they become part of your active vocabulary.
Exactly. That process can't really be downloaded.
I like that. You can download an English app, but you can't download fluency.
You can download information, but you can't instantly download experience.
And experience is slow.
Usually very slow.
Maybe that's why people sometimes become discouraged when learning something new. They expect visible progress every day.
Yes, but progress isn't always visible. Think about someone learning pronunciation. For weeks, they may feel as if they're making the same mistakes. Then one day they hear a native speaker say a sentence and suddenly recognize the rhythm automatically.
The change happened gradually, but they only noticed it suddenly.
Exactly. A lot of learning happens underneath the surface.
So perhaps waiting isn't always passive.
That's important. Waiting can contain activity that isn't immediately visible.
Like planting a seed.
That's a familiar metaphor, but it works.
You can't stand over the soil and demand that the plant grow faster.
You can water it, give it sunlight, and take care of it, but you still have to wait.
And if you keep digging it up every day to check whether the roots are growing, you'll probably damage it.
That's actually a good description of anxiety.
How so?
Sometimes we keep checking something because we want proof that progress is happening, but constant checking can interfere with the process. You check your inbox 20 times, reread the message, look at the application status, ask someone for an update, and none of that makes the decision happen faster.
It only makes the waiting more stressful.
Exactly.
So perhaps one way to wait better is to create distance between ourselves and the thing we're waiting for.
Yes, give it some space.
That's difficult when it's important.
Of course, but even a little distance helps. Instead of checking every 5 minutes, decide when you'll check. Instead of thinking about the result all day, give yourself another activity.
That sounds simple, but it probably requires practice.
Everything involving patience requires practice.
Maybe that's why small waiting situations can actually train us.
Like standing in a queue without reaching for your phone.
Or letting someone finish speaking without preparing your response.
Or waiting a few minutes before replying to an emotional message.
That's a good one.
Sometimes the best response is not the fastest response.
Especially when you're angry.
Yes, if you receive a message that upsets you, replying immediately may feel satisfying for 30 seconds and regrettable for 3 days.
Waiting gives your emotions time to settle.
And once the emotion becomes less intense, you may still disagree, but you'll probably express yourself differently.
So waiting can improve communication.
Absolutely.
Which means that waiting isn't always the enemy of productivity or communication. Sometimes waiting protects us from making bad decisions.
Exactly. A pause can create space for better thinking.
That's probably why some important decisions shouldn't be made immediately.
Yes, sometimes you need to sleep on something.
That phrase is interesting. Sleep on it.
It means giving yourself time before making a decision.
And it reflects the idea that time itself can change the way we see a problem.
Right. You may wake up the next morning and realize that what seemed urgent last night isn't actually that important.
Or you may realize that your first reaction was too emotional.
Exactly.
So maybe waiting isn't simply about tolerating time. It's also about allowing time to work on us.
That's a much deeper idea.
And I think that's where waiting becomes connected to growing older. When you're young, you want things to happen immediately. As you get older, you begin to understand that some of the best things in life need time.
And you also become more familiar with endings. You learn that waiting eventually stops. The bus arrives. The meeting ends. The answer comes. The holiday begins. The difficult period changes.
That's probably why experience makes waiting easier.
Yes, you develop confidence that uncertainty has an ending.
Even if you don't know exactly when.
Exactly.
And perhaps that's the part we need to remember when we're in the middle of a difficult waiting period. We may not know when it will end, but that doesn't mean it will last forever.
That's true.
I like that waiting isn't just an empty space between two events anymore.
What is it then?
Maybe it's a space where we don't have complete control, and we have to decide how we're going to live inside that uncertainty.
That's a pretty good definition.
And maybe that's why waiting reveals so much about people.
Because when there's nothing to do, we have to face ourselves a little more.
Which explains why we immediately reach for our phones.
Exactly.
Maybe we're not afraid of waiting. Maybe we're afraid of having nothing between us and our own thoughts.
Now that's a much bigger conversation.
We'll have to continue that after the break.
And hopefully, our listeners won't have to wait too long.
I was expecting you to say that.
I couldn't resist.
All right, let's stop here for a moment.
We'll be back.
When we stopped earlier, we were talking about something that I hadn't really considered before. Maybe we don't always reach for our phones because we're bored. Sometimes we reach for them because we're uncomfortable with having nothing between ourselves and our own thoughts. I kept thinking about that after we finished recording.
I did too. And I actually tried something on the way home. I was waiting for a bus and I deliberately left my phone in my pocket. It was only about 15 minutes, but it felt strangely long at first. I kept having the urge to check something, even though I knew there was nothing I needed to check.
What did you do instead?
I watched the people around me. There was a woman trying to keep her umbrella from turning inside out because of the wind. 2 teenagers were arguing about where they should go for dinner. A man was carrying a huge box that looked much too large for him. Someone's dog kept trying to walk in the opposite direction.
So basically, you discovered that the world was still happening while you weren't looking at a screen.
That's exactly what happened. And after a few minutes, I became less aware of the fact that I was waiting. I stopped counting the minutes.
That's interesting because I think counting is one of the things that makes waiting feel longer. When you keep checking the time, you're constantly reminding yourself that you're waiting.
Yes, you turn time into an object you're measuring,
And once you start measuring every minute becomes noticeable.
which makes it feel slower.
It's similar to being on a long flight. If you keep checking how many hours are left, the journey can feel endless.
I've done that. You look at the screen and think, 7 hours and 40 minutes. Then you watch something, have a snack, talk to someone, and check again. Somehow only 7 hours and 10 minutes remain.
And you're disappointed that 30 minutes have disappeared, instead of being happy that you've already completed 30 minutes.
Exactly. Your attention is focused on the remaining time rather than the time that's already passed.
That seems to be a common problem with waiting. We focus so much on the future event that the present moment becomes almost invisible.
Yes, and sometimes we even miss enjoyable parts of the present because we're waiting for something better.
Like waiting for the weekend, while spending the entire week thinking about Saturday.
Or waiting for a holiday while barely enjoying the weeks before it.
Or waiting for a promotion, and forgetting that you actually have a life outside work.
Or waiting to become fluent in English instead of noticing that you're already understanding more than you did 6 months ago.
That's a good example.
Because learning can create this strange mental trap. You think, I'll be happy when my English is good enough. But then you improve, and suddenly the target moves further away.
You start thinking about advanced vocabulary, more natural pronunciation, faster listening, more confidence.
Exactly, there is always another level.
Which can be motivating, but it can also make you feel as if you're permanently waiting to become the person you want to be.
That's true.
Maybe that's another reason waiting is so interesting. Sometimes we're not waiting for an event. We're waiting for a version of ourselves.
That's a really important distinction.
We wait to feel more confident. We wait until we're healthier. We wait until we have more money. We wait until we know what we want to do. We wait until our English is better. We wait until we have more time.
And sometimes the danger is that life becomes a series of conditions. I'll do this when that happens.
And the when keeps moving.
Exactly.
But I don't want this conversation to turn into one of those motivational talks where we say, stop waiting and live your best life.
I'm glad you said that.
Because waiting is sometimes necessary.
Absolutely. There are situations where you genuinely have to wait. If you're waiting for medical test results, you can't simply decide not to wait. If you're waiting for a visa, you can't make the process happen through positive thinking. If you're waiting for a child to be born, there's a biological timetable. If you're waiting for a train, you can't make it arrive by becoming more productive.
So telling people to just stop waiting can be unrealistic.
Yes, the real question is what we do while we're waiting.
That feels much more useful.
Exactly. We can't always control the waiting period, but we can sometimes control our relationship with it.
Let's go back to airports, because I think they're one of the best places to study human behavior around waiting. Airports are full of people who are temporarily between places. They're not quite where they came from, and they're not yet where they're going.
And everyone has a different relationship with time there. Some people arrive 3 hours early and seem completely relaxed. Others arrive 40 minutes before departure and run through the terminal as if they're in an action movie.
I've been both people.
Same here.
When I was younger, I preferred arriving at the last possible moment. I thought getting there early was a waste of time.
And now,
Now I prefer arriving early.
what changed?
I discovered that rushing makes the whole journey more stressful than it needs to be. When I arrive early, I can find the gate, get some water, sit down, and look around. There's something nice about knowing that I don't have to move immediately.
That's interesting because arriving early creates a different kind of waiting. You're still waiting, but you've chosen the waiting period.
Exactly. It feels less like lost time because I made a deliberate decision to be there.
Choice seems to appear again.
Yes, choice changes the emotional experience of time.
That's probably why waiting for a friend can be enjoyable when you arrive early at a cafe. You sit down, order something, maybe read, and then the person arrives. But if you're already late and the other person isn't there, the same 10 minutes can feel completely different.
Because now you're anxious.
Right, you're looking at the door every 30 seconds.
And then you start wondering whether you should send a message.
Then you send one.
Then you see read.
And suddenly, you have new information that creates even more questions.
Why do 2 words, read and nothing else, have so much power?
Technology has created some very strange forms of waiting.
We didn't used to know whether someone had read a letter.
You also didn't know whether someone had received it 5 minutes ago,
Now we can sometimes see exactly when someone opened a message.
which sounds helpful, but psychologically it can make waiting harder.
Because before, silence simply meant silence.
Now silence can come with a timestamp.
That's almost cruel.
A little.
You send a message at 8:03. They read it at 8:07. It's now 8:15 and there's no response.
And your brain starts asking questions.
Why did they read it?
Why haven't they replied?
Did I say something wrong?
Are they thinking about what to say?
Maybe they're busy.
Maybe they forgot.
Maybe they don't want to talk.
And the funny thing is that all of those explanations are possible.
Which means the information that they're reading the message doesn't actually tell us very much.
Exactly. More information doesn't always create more certainty.
That's an important point. We sometimes assume that technology reduces uncertainty because it gives us more information. But sometimes it gives us information that we don't know how to interpret.
Yes, a little information can create a lot of speculation.
And then waiting becomes a kind of detective work.
You start analyzing punctuation,
Typing speed,
response length,
whether they used an emoji.
whether they normally use that emoji.
This sounds ridiculous when we say it out loud.
But people do it.
All the time.
And that's because human beings are extremely sensitive to social signals.
Especially when we care about the person.
Exactly.
Maybe waiting is easier when we don't care about the outcome.
Definitely. If I enter a competition and don't really care whether I win, waiting for the result isn't very stressful. But if I've spent months preparing and winning would change my plans, waiting becomes much harder.
So emotional investment increases the weight of waiting.
Yes, the more important the outcome, the more attention we give to the waiting period.
Which explains why waiting for something small can sometimes be easier than waiting for something important, even when the small thing takes longer.
Right, you can wait 40 minutes for a pizza without thinking too much about it. But waiting 10 minutes for someone to tell you whether your job application was successful can feel enormous.
Because one involves dinner and the other involves your future.
Exactly.
Although if you're really hungry, the pizza can become very important.
I knew you'd find a way to defend the pizza.
I'm consistent.
I'll give you that.
There's another kind of waiting that I think deserves attention. Waiting in line.
Queues.
Yes, the great human experiment.
Queues are fascinating because they create a temporary social agreement. Everyone accepts that there is an order, and everyone expects other people to respect it.
And the moment someone breaks that agreement, the atmosphere changes.
Absolutely. If someone joins the line in the middle, people notice immediately.
Even if nobody says anything.
You can feel the collective reaction.
People look at each other.
Someone suddenly becomes very interested in the person who just joined.
And then there is the question of whether someone will say something.
That's the interesting part. Most people don't want to create a confrontation, but they also don't want the system to feel unfair,
So everyone waits to see what everyone else will do.
which creates another kind of waiting.
Social waiting.
Exactly. You're not just waiting for your turn. You're waiting to see whether the social rules will be respected.
And sometimes queues move very quickly once they start moving.
Yes, there's always that moment when you realize you've been standing still for 10 minutes. Then suddenly, everyone moves forward 3 meters.
And your mood immediately improves.
It's amazing how a few meters can change your emotional state.
Because movement creates the feeling of progress.
That's probably one of the biggest differences between waiting with visible progress and waiting without visible progress.
If you're standing in a queue and you can see yourself getting closer to the front, you tolerate it more easily.
Exactly, even if the total wait is long.
But if nothing seems to change, 5 minutes can feel endless.
That's why waiting for a web page to load can feel so annoying. If there's a progress bar moving, you have some evidence that something is happening. If the screen just freezes, you don't know whether to wait or refresh.
And then you refresh.
Of course,
Then the page takes even longer.
and you regret refreshing.
Technology teaches us patience and destroys it at the same time.
That's probably the theme of our entire conversation.
Maybe.
Another interesting thing about queues is that people often try to estimate how long they'll be waiting based on other people's behavior.
You watch the cashier.
You watch the person in front of you.
You count how many people are ahead.
You look at how many items they're holding.
And then someone in front of you suddenly pulls out a full basket.
That's devastating.
You thought they had 3 things.
Now they have 27.
And one of them needs a price check.
At that point, you begin questioning your life choices.
Especially if another queue seems to be moving faster.
Which brings us to the dangerous habit of comparing waiting times.
Never look at another queue.
That's the rule.
Because the moment you look, you will believe you chose the wrong one.
And even if the difference is only 30 seconds, you'll feel personally betrayed by your queue.
But there's something deeper there. Comparison can make waiting feel worse, even when the actual wait hasn't changed.
Yes, if everyone around you is waiting for 20 minutes, you may accept it. But if you discover that another person waited only 5 minutes, suddenly your 20 minutes feels unfair.
So waiting is partly relative.
Very much so.
That probably happens at work too.
Hell,
Imagine 2 employees are both waiting for a promotion. One gets promoted first. The other might be disappointed even if they knew the promotion process could take months.
because now the waiting has a comparison attached to it.
Exactly. Before the other person was promoted, the waiting was simply uncertainty. Afterward, it becomes comparison.
And comparison changes the emotional meaning.
The same thing happens with salaries, career progress, relationships, and even language learning.
Absolutely. You may feel proud of your English until you meet someone who has been learning for half the time and speaks more fluently,
Then suddenly your own progress feels smaller.
even though nothing about your progress has changed.
That's an important reminder. Someone else's progress doesn't erase yours.
But our brains don't always behave logically,
No,
especially when we're waiting for something.
because waiting gives us time to compare,
And comparison gives us more things to think about.
which can make the waiting period feel even longer.
Yes,
I wonder if that's why waiting in public spaces can sometimes be strangely comforting. You're surrounded by other people who are also waiting, so you're reminded that you're not the only person whose plans have been interrupted.
that's a good point. A delayed train can be frustrating, but when everyone on the platform is experiencing the same delay, there is a sense of shared inconvenience.
People sometimes start talking to each other.
Yes, that's one of the interesting things about unexpected waiting. It can create conversations that wouldn't otherwise happen.
I've had that happen at airports. Someone starts talking because the flight is delayed, and suddenly you've been having a conversation with a stranger for 20 minutes,
And you might never see that person again,
which makes the conversation strangely easy.
because there are no long-term expectations.
You're both temporarily in the same place, dealing with the same problem.
Exactly. Waiting creates a temporary community.
That's a nice phrase.
A bus stop community, an airport community, a hospital waiting room community, a queue community.
And then the moment the waiting ends, the community disappears,
Everyone gets on the train and goes somewhere different.
which means that waiting can bring people together without any of them planning it.
Yes, that's one of the positive sides of waiting,
We usually talk about waiting as something negative,
because we're focused on inconvenience.
but waiting can create space for unexpected experiences.
Absolutely.
Although hospital waiting rooms are probably the hardest example, because the reason people are there may be serious.
Yes, that's a different kind of waiting. You're not waiting for entertainment or convenience. You're waiting for information about something that matters deeply.
And the atmosphere is completely different.
People speak more quietly. They watch the doors. They look at the clock. They may not know each other, but there is an unspoken understanding.
Everyone is waiting for something important,
And sometimes the waiting itself becomes emotionally exhausting.
which reminds me that we shouldn't talk about patience as if everyone is waiting under the same conditions.
That's very important.
Waiting for a coffee is not the same as waiting for medical results.
Waiting for a package is not the same as waiting for news about someone you love.
Waiting for a holiday is not the same as waiting for a decision that could change your career.
The word waiting covers very different experiences.
And perhaps that's why some advice about patience sounds too simple.
Yes, just be patient can be comforting in some situations and completely useless in others.
Sometimes what people need isn't patience. They need information, support, or someone to acknowledge that the waiting is difficult.
That's true.
Maybe one of the kindest things we can do for someone who is waiting is simply to recognize that they're waiting.
Instead of saying, "Don't worry."
Yes, don't worry doesn't always help.
Sometimes I know this is difficult. I'm here if you need me is much better.
Because you're not trying to remove their feelings.
You're just sharing the uncertainty with them.
And perhaps that's what makes waiting easier in relationships. You don't necessarily need someone to solve the problem. You need someone to stay with you while you wait.
That's beautifully said.
And maybe that's why people remember who was there during difficult waiting periods.
Yes, not necessarily what the person said, but that they stayed.
They answered the phone.
They sat beside you.
They brought you coffee.
They checked in.
They didn't disappear.
Those small actions can make a long wait feel less lonely.
And loneliness changes the experience of time too.
Definitely. Time passes differently when you're alone with uncertainty.
Which brings us back to the phone.
The phone can reduce loneliness, but it can also increase it.
How?
Because being connected to hundreds of people digitally doesn't necessarily mean you're sharing the actual moment with anyone. You can scroll through hundreds of posts while sitting alone in a waiting room, but you're still physically alone.
That's true.
Sometimes putting the phone away and talking to the person next to you may create more genuine connection than scrolling through messages from people who aren't there.
That's a slightly uncomfortable truth.
The phone gives us access to people, but access isn't the same as presence.
And waiting makes that distinction more obvious.
Yes,
Because when nothing is happening, we become more aware of whether we're actually connected to anyone around us.
and perhaps that's why some waiting periods stay in our memories.
Not because we waited, but because of what happened while we were waiting.
Exactly.
A conversation at an airport.
A stranger's joke on a delayed train.
A quiet moment before an important appointment.
A long conversation with a friend while waiting for dinner.
A message that finally arrived after hours of uncertainty.
The waiting becomes part of the story.
And sometimes the thing we were waiting for isn't even the most memorable part.
That's interesting.
You might remember the conversation you had while waiting for the train more clearly than the train journey itself.
Or remember the people you met during a delayed flight rather than the flight.
which suggests that waiting isn't necessarily empty time.
It can be the background in which something unexpected happens.
Maybe we just have to leave enough space for that something to happen.
And that's difficult when we're constantly filling every second.
So perhaps the challenge isn't learning how to wait faster.
Maybe it's learning how to wait differently.
That sounds like a good direction for the next part.
I have a feeling we're going to be waiting a lot longer before we figure this out.
That's okay.
At least we're getting somewhere.
Are we?
Slowly,
Fair enough.
and maybe slowly is the whole point.
Let's leave it there for now.
We'll continue after this.
See you soon.